Alright guys, so we're back in the shop working on our Dark Horse Mustang, and we've actually got the transmission out over to Tick Performance, and we've got it taken apart, doing some upgrades to it, the cryo treatment, rim polishing. We're doing all that to that transmission right now. So while we're waiting on that part to get done, we're going to take a look at the clutch that we're going to put in the car. So what I have in front of me is a Mantic twin disc, and Jeff at Mantic brought this down a couple of weeks ago. We actually shot an install video for the Dark Horse, or for the 24 up, if you want to call it, S650 Mustang. So that way they could have their content around this clutch and around that platform. So there are a few things about this clutch that I want to point out and talk about before we stick it in the car. The first thing is weight. The factory S650 clutch, at least in the Dark Horse, is a dual mass setup, meaning that it has a flywheel that moves on the flywheel. That way it cushions the feel when you let out of the clutch, gives you a nicer, smoother operation as far as driver comfort is concerned. Maybe not necessarily for performance, but for driver comfort specifically. This eliminates that, and one thing to notate specifically when it comes to taking a dual mass out and putting a normal style back in is the weight difference. So the factory clutch that came out of our S650 car weighed in at about 61 pounds, and you can see that this Mantic clutch weighed 36 pounds, so a 25-pound weight savings. Yes, I know that the Mantic system has an aluminum flywheel with it, and the factory one is iron, but that's a massive weight savings in just a clutch. So it's going to be able to rev a lot freer, feel a lot better as far as track performance is concerned. It will be a little more positive of a feel because it doesn't have the dual mass anymore, but it will be more for performance. Another thing that I want to notate is the way that you actually set this system up. A lot of people will just get this clutch, take it apart out of the box, not notate how it was assembled, throw it under the car, and then they'll wonder why their clutch didn't disengage properly after the install. So to show you quickly about how you need to install this Mantic clutch, it's very simple. It bolts together just like any common clutch does as far as the pressure plate bolting to it. But one of the important factors is any clutch, in fact, not just Mantic, that uses a floater plate with this type of spring system, there's two things you need to know. In the case of this one having an aluminum flywheel, this spring is a hardened material and it will wear through the flywheel if you don't install it correctly. And you can see these bolts around the perimeter. These bolt heads are hardened. These springs are meant to ride on these bolt heads instead of the aluminum. So you can clock this thing incorrectly. Another thing to notate is the spring height away from the floater plate. So this spring has to compress when the assembly is put together. So you need to make sure that all of these distances between the spring and the floater plate itself are correct. You don't want them to be off on one side or flat on one side or every other one is messed up. You want them to all be relatively the same. In this case, you can take a pair of calipers and measure between the plate and the spring, and you're going to be somewhere in the neighborhood of 340 thousandths on this particular one. Make sure that they're all the same because that's how it's going to disengage properly. Now on systems like this that are triple discs, they'll have two of these floater plates with springs on them. And another thing to know about that is make sure you have your springs offset. So if you have two of these rings, make sure that you offset them from one another. That way you don't have a spring against a spring, because then you're also going to have a problem. Now that you know a little bit about how this is supposed to be set up, let's take it over here and get it installed. Alright, so these Mantic clutches come with bolts to hold your stands that actually hold and attach your pressure plate. And you need to install these through the back side of the flywheel in their respective holes before you install the flywheel. They actually lock into this groove in the back of this one. And you got to install these first before you put it on the engine, because if not, you don't have a way to get them in. And grab a flywheel bolt. As with most engines, there is a specific way this has to go on here. You have to line the bolt holes up. I have done that in advance to make sure I didn't look like an idiot. All right, now we can finish installing our bolts. So the reason that we're getting rid of the dual mass flywheel and clutch assembly in this car is because we know that we're going to do some performance stuff with it, specifically like track racing, autocross, and maybe some drag racing as well. So we went ahead and upgraded the entire clutch system because we know that given the things that we're going to do to this car, horsepower increases, the treatment that it's going to see, we're going to have problems out of it. So it just made sense while we had the transmission out to go ahead and replace the clutch with something that's going to be more up to the task. So the factory clutch in this car, I want to say it kind of felt a little spongy. It was pretty smooth as far as how it would engage. It wasn't aggressive or anything. Again, it's a stock clutch with organic discs, so it's not going to be very aggressive. But you know, it was very heavy, and you can tell that. And when you would shift it, like when you were trying to shift it really fast, you could definitely tell that it was all stock components you were shifting and meant to be soft and spongy. You know, one of the other things that we're going to do specifically is change this feed line down to the transmission. We're going to get rid of the hard plastic pressure line that runs to the release bearing, replace that with a braided, again for feel. All of this is really to get the feel and performance that we want for what we're going to be putting the car through. Okay, so we've got all of our bolts ran up. Now we're going to torque these to spec. I don't know if there's a specific call out for doing this in stages, but I like to do this in stages, so that's what I'm going to do. Have a flywheel holder here. And I'm going to go ahead and do my first round on them. Also going to do this in a crossing pattern just to make it even. So I just got done with my first pass. Now we're going to torque these to 70 foot-pounds. That's where they're staying. Okay, so with our flywheel installed, we can now start installing floater plates and clutch discs. But first we need to install our stands, our pressure plate stands. So these stands, or spacers, whatever you want to call them, they are a specific length to make sure that you have the correct amount of spring pressure from the diaphragm spring in the pressure plate. So they are a specific length for each application. Make sure that your bolts are pulled through the flywheel fully. It's going to be important for installing these. You'll see that they kind of register against the inside of the actual surface for the clutch disc as well. Alright, stands installed. Now we can grab our clutch discs and floater plates and start getting those installed. Alright, so we're going to put our first disc on. We're going to put our first disc in place. You can see this one is labeled flywheel side. You're literally going to put the flywheel side toward the flywheel. Not rocket science, pretty simple. Line up tool. Install our first disc. And then we're going to install our floater plate. Now it's also, I've got this labeled just because, but pressure plate side. That way I like to take everything apart and just make sure that it all goes back exactly the same. But remember, the springs need to go on top of the bolt heads. So orient this to where the spring is going to line up with the bolt head and then install it. Just like that. Now I'm going to grab our second disc, and you can see that it literally says pressure plate side. That is literally going to go toward the pressure plate, so it's going to come toward the outside. The reason for that is, and a lot of people don't know this, but the hub is offset to one side or the other. So what we're doing is making sure that the hubs themselves between the discs never make contact. So you want to offset these things away from each other, and in some cases away from the flywheel. Just depends on the clutch that you're putting together. I'm going to come up here, place the disc as mentioned, get back up on my splines, and make sure my tool's in place. Okay. Again, I'm going to make sure all of my bolts are pulled out fully. You may have to do this a couple of times because you're gonna bump them at some point doing this. now we can install. So now we can install the pressure ring and pressure plate. Obviously, flat side goes against the disc, and the high side would go out. That's the actual pressure ring. And this one does not have a specific clocking. It can go just about any way. Just like that. And then our pressure plate cover. Okay, so then we can install our hardware. You can see this lock washer is beveled. You're going to put the bevel side down, so the concave side down against the pressure plate. And start the nuts. So a lot of your late model vehicles, including this one, come factory with a twin disc. And the reason for that is because these cars are getting heavier with all the added equipment that they're getting, stereo systems, all of the driver assists and hands-free driving and stuff like that. So these cars get heavier by the year, and to hold all that weight with the kind of horsepower that cars are also now making, the manufacturers are using twin disc clutches. And the reason for that is because you can still get a smooth operation with more clamping load. So you get a clutch that can grip under more extreme conditions, more horsepower, more weight, while maintaining a better driver feel, or a better, smoother feel operation, if you will. So if you're someone out there that's debating between a single disc and a twin disc, just know that a twin disc is going to be able to give you more clamping ability with less aggression. So it'll drive better than a single disc, and it'll hold more power than a single disc. And the same goes for triples as well. Something to know about this clutch in this car. Again, this chassis is a S650, so 24 up Mustang. And the reason that we were test fitting this for Mantic originally is because the 24 up is actually a different clutch. And we've seen some people comment, well, it's the same as the S650 car. It's not. It's not the same. The flywheel teeth are different, and the starter itself is different from the S650 car. So in order to make sure that all this was going to be kosher and work correctly, we wanted to just verify all of our measurements and dimensions prior to putting out any information about this specific platform. But it is different than an S650 car. So if you've got an 18 to 24 clutch that you're going to put in your 24 car, stop now. Talk to your manufacturer, make sure they've given you the correct parts. Or call Tech Performance and we'll get it taken care of for you. Okay, so these nuts are a 13 millimeter. I'm just going to start running them down. The way that I like to do this, to make sure that my clutch discs are perfectly in the center, I like to put some pressure on this, pushing it toward the engine, and then just kind of feel for where it bottoms out squarely. So like right there, it's about as square as I'm going to get it. And I like to maintain pressure until I get the pressure plate tight enough that I know those discs are going to hold themselves in place. And now my tool comes in and out freely without me having to do anything else to make that happen. Again, just kind of work your way around the perimeter. We're going to just snug these down by hand before we torque them. We're going to make sure that the pressure plate is fully seated on all of these pressure plate stands. That way we can ensure that everything is installed properly prior to actually torquing these down. And there's no need to use a large ratchet for this because we're just simply snugging these down prior to torquing. So when you're installing a twin disc, just make sure that you have the discs oriented the correct direction, because it is a common issue for people to put those things in backward. Okay, we've got all of our fasteners ran up, so now we're going to torque these in place. And we can go ahead and ditch the alignment tool because those discs aren't moving now. So we're going to torque these in place to 33 Newton meters. Again, in a crisscross pattern. And I'm just going to go around one more time, make sure everything's good. All right, there you have it. The clutch is 100% installed and we're ready to stick the transmission back in. So now once we get that thing back from TIC with its new upgrades, we're going to put this thing back together and see how it drives. If you're in the market for a new clutch for your Mustang, give us a call. We have a wide variety available of different clutches, including Mantic. If you're needing help making a selection, feel free to give one of our techs a call. They'll be more than happy to walk you through everything you need to know and make sure that you're making the right decision for your car.